Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. As you might already know, the Poe Museum boasts a world-renowned collection of Edgar Allan Poe photographs. In fact, it has some of the most iconic images of this iconic author who just happened to be the first American author to be widely photographed. During his 40 short years, he had at least 8 daguerreotypes made of himself, 1 oil painting, and 2 watercolors. But was one of his photographs taken by a renowned American photographer who is today considered the father of photojournalism? We'll find out on tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. Well, here it is. It might not look like much, but when this photograph came to the Poe Museum's collection back in 1925, it was valued at $100, or about $1,700 in today's money, for this little thing. So who is a photographer? Well, on the back here, we'll see identifies it as coming from Brady's National Portrait Gallery. That's Mathew Brady, the one I told you was considered the father of photojournalism. During the Civil War, he went to the front lines and he was very often in danger. So he and his team documented the horrors of battle. And that's one of the reasons he's really well known today, and also because he photographed 18 US presidents. So pretty well known, highly regarded figure in American photography. And his story about this photograph is that Poe came to his studio in New York City. Let's look on the back. It says, Edgar Allan Poe, 1844. That was the year that Brady opened his daguerreotype studio in New York. Poe at the time had just moved there himself, and according to a much later count, almost 50 years later, Brady said, I had great admiration for Poe and had William Ross Wallace, a poet, bring him to my studio. Poe rather shrank from coming as if he thought it was going to cost him something. Many a poet has had that daguerreotype copied by me. So Brady says that Poe came to his studio and got his picture taken free of charge, and then Brady copied it and sold copies from his studio. So this is one of the copies of that daguerreotype. We know it's not a daguerreotype because a daguerreotype is on a silver-plated piece of copper, whereas this is just a piece of card. This is an albumen print carte de visite. It's about the size of a calling card, and also you could put it into your album. And what we do know about this is its history only goes back to maybe the early 1860s. That's when he first started selling copies of this from his studio. So if he took it back in 1844, why did he not sell copies of it until the 1860s? That's because he's lying. If you look at it closely, it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to see that this is just a copy of the 1848 daguerreotype taken by a completely different photographer in Providence, Rhode Island. And also, this doesn't show Poe in 1844. We have a watercolor, an engraving, and a daguerreotype that shows Poe right about that time. Not only does he not have the mustache yet, but he has sideburns. So this is obviously not Poe in 1844, but it's simply a copy of somebody else's daguerreotype. Brady touched it up a little bit in the hair and claimed that he'd taken it himself. Now this isn't the first or last time that Brady embellished the truth or took credit for other people's photography, and it's not the only photographer who claimed erroneously that Poe sat for him. In fact, Gabriel Harrison claimed the same thing, had a similar story about how Poe stopped by his New York City studio and had his photograph taken, but it was actually a photograph taken years later by somebody completely different. Everybody wanted to claim after the fact that they'd taken advantage of the opportunity to take a picture of Poe. But if you look back in the records, just 2 years after Poe's death, Brady published an advertisement in the newspaper listing 107 of the famous Americans whose photographs he'd taken, and Poe's not on that list. But there's another reason why this is an important little document. This used to belong to Edgar Allan Poe's only sister, Rosalie Poe. Now, she was about a year younger than Edgar, and when they were orphaned, Edgar was 2, his sister was a year old. They were sent to live with different families. He went to live with the Allens. She went to live nearby with the Mackenzies here in Richmond. When she grew up, she became a school teacher. And whenever Edgar was in town visiting, he made a point of stopping by her house where he was good friends with her and her foster brothers and her whole foster family. She was always very devoted to Poe's memory. She loved to go see him perform his works. In fact, there's a description of one of his readings of the Raven at a private residence. At the end, he sat down saying, "And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore." And she went in and sat on his lap. So there's all sorts of great stories like that about the close relationship he had with his sister. And after he died, she was destitute. The school where she taught had closed down. Richmond was at war, and she went up to Baltimore and Washington, D.C. to live with relatives up north. But to make extra money, she started selling photographs of her famous brother on the street corners. And this is the one that she said was her favorite photograph of Poe. It was the best likeness, according to her. And these are actually 2 copies that are directly connected to her. These are ones she gave this to one of her relatives. She gave this one to one of Poe's childhood friends. But this particular image wasn't available until about 1868. Now, Mathew Brady's photograph of Poe, this was available by the early 1860s. So I imagine she was selling and giving out copies of this before she started selling and giving out copies of that one. So this probably would have been from about 1861 until 1868. She would have been giving out this one. In fact, she gave this one to one of her benefactors. It was a Mrs. English. And Mrs. English, before her death, gave it to one of her friends, Belle Fitzpatrick. And Belle Fitzpatrick is the one who gave it to the Poe Museum in 1925 and died about 3 years later. So we trace the provenance directly back to Poe's sister and to those desperate final years when she was traveling around, bouncing from one relative's house to another, and finally ended up in a charity home in Washington, D.C., where she died in 1874 at the age of 63. So even if Mathew Brady didn't take this, it does tell us a little bit of something about Rosalie Poe and what she was doing in those years after her famous brother died. She was always very proud of her brother's legacy, and she made a little extra money in her final years by not only selling photographs of Poe, but by selling desks where Poe wrote The Raven. A while later, they found out she sold several different desks where Poe had written The Raven. So maybe you can't trust old Rose Poe. So what do you think? Do you agree with Poe's sister that this is the best likeness of him ever made? Or do you prefer the Brady photo of Poe and the daguerreotype he copied to get this photo? Let us know down in the comments. And if you'd like to help us preserve precious Poe pieces like these CDVs sold by Edgar Allan Poe's sister, why not support the Poe Museum or become a member at poemuseum.org. And until next time, thanks for joining us, and I'll leave you with more gratuitous footage of Pluto, the Poe Museum cat, just rolling around and stuff.